If you'll kindly be seated, we can begin. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first set of speakers who will be presenting papers relating to the relationship between the United States and Italy. Our first speaker, who has already been presented to you, Professor Spencer Discala, has been with the University of Massachusetts at Boston for the better part of 20 years. He is one of the leading scholars of Italian socialism in the United States, has published several books, two of which I will mention. One, The Dilemmas of Italian Socialism, The Politics of Filippo Turati, published by the University of Massachusetts Press. More recently, a volume entitled Renewing Italian Socialism, published by Oxford. He has written innumerable papers and articles, and I understand until recently has been a regular contributor to the newspaper Avanti in Italy. He will speak to you today about Salvemini in the United States.
Thanks, Nunzio. Gaetano Salvemini represents a rare breed in Italian history. Born in the agricultural region of Puglia in 1873, he managed to achieve a sophisticated education at the University of Florence. He became a professor and an activist in the Italian Socialist Party. A convinced reformist, he abhorred revolutionary ideology and condemned communism. Nonetheless, his corrosive criticism of the reformists, especially on the Southern question, and his battle with Filippo Turati at the beginning of the century remain legendary. In 1911, he left the party but always professed himself a socialist. He founded the extremely influential newspaper L'Unità, not the most recent one, and with Leonida Bissolati advocated Italian entrance into World War I on a democratic interventionist platform. After the war, he sought a just peace on Wilsonian terms, drawing the fulminations of nationalists down on his head in the process, just as he had done earlier with his dogged opposition to the Libyan war. With the rise of Mussolini, he established one of the first opposition publications, called Non Mollare, and he became one of the earliest exiles from fascism. During this vast political activity, matched by an unbelievable outpouring of political publications, Salvemini also made an important mark in his chosen field of history, with such fundamental works as Magnati e Popolani in Firenze, La Rivoluzione Francese, and a biography of Giuseppe Mazzini. Thus, when fascism forced him into exile, his reputation as a historian preceded him and allowed him to earn a living, unlike many other Italian intellectuals, by following his profession. After living in France and England, he found his way to the United States, where he became professor of Italian civilization at Harvard University. A number of Italian anti-fascist professors taught at other American universities, but none of them had the experience or prestige of Salvemini. In their attempt to mobilize American opinion against Mussolini, they recognized Salvemini as their leader. Furthermore, the anti-fascist struggle was not centered only in the universities, which contributed to splits in the movement. The anti-fascists vied with the fascist government and its network of consulates for the hearts and minds of the Italian-American community. A complex interrelationship resulted, of which the Salvemini group was an intimate part. Salvemini's prodigious activity reflects an important aspect of the American and Italian history of the interwar period and gives the lie to biographer Gaspare De Caro's contention that Salvemini, quote, isolated himself in Widener Library. An American chronology. Given Salvemini's travels after going into exile and for the sake of clarity, it might be useful to recall the various stops in his long journey. At the age of 50, Salvemini found it necessary to learn English, a language he never learned to speak very well. As we learn from his Memoria di un fuoriuscito, and from the reports by Italian officials preserved in the Archivio Centrale dello Stato, he spent the years from 1925 to 1932 primarily in England. He traveled frequently to France during those years and participated actively in the anti-fascist struggle in both countries. He was close to Carlo Rosselli, also from Florence, and was a co-founder of Giustizia e Libertà, the best known of the interwar anti-fascist organizations. The most famous periodicals of both countries, as well as small circulation anti-fascist publications, carried his articles. During the same period, he also published two important books on fascism: The Fascist Dictatorship in Italy, published in the United States in 1927 and in England in 1928, and Mussolini, a Diplomat, in France in 1932. In 1927 and 29, Salvemini conducted two lecture tours of the United States. These trips allowed him to earn the funds to continue his Spartan existence and his struggle against fascism. During his second voyage, he taught at Yale and at the New School for Social Research. He went to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to meet George Lapiana, an Italian specialist on church history teaching at Harvard. Besides becoming excellent friends, as Salvemini states in his memoirs, Lapiana introduced him to some of the best American historians of the period, including Arthur Schlesinger, Sr., William Langer, and others. Before leaving for Europe, a man named Lauro de Bosis passed by to meet him. A young monarchist and liberal, in the Italian sense, de Bosis headed the America-Italy Society, considered by Salvemini to be a fascist front. De Bosis overcame Salvemini's reluctance to see him by explaining that he had dropped his earlier philo-fascist ideas. During their conversation, de Bosis told Salvemini that he planned to fly over Rome to drop leaflets urging the Italians to end the fascist regime. Salvemini cited the dangers involved, but did not discourage him. In October 1931, de Bosis carried out his dangerous mission. Leaving from Marseille, he reached Rome, but disappeared on his return flight to Corsica, probably having run out of fuel. Following de Bosis' death, his fiancée, Ruth Draper, endowed a chair at Harvard University in de Bosis' name. Draper, an American actress and descendant of newspaper publisher Charles A. Dana, made certain that the chair would go to Salvemini. "It was the permanent solution to my economic problem," Salvemini commented in his memoirs. He remained at Harvard from 1934 to 1948, when he returned to Italy. The consulates versus Salvemini. Besides economics and the possibility to do research in the historical area, a major reason for Salvemini to settle in the United States was a large Italian-American population. He hoped that he would be able to counteract the influence of the Italian consulates and of the major Italian-American newspapers, especially Generoso Pope's Il Progresso Italo-Americano, which was sympathetic to the Italian regime. The years before Italy's entrance into World War II witnessed an ongoing battle between Salvemini and the Italian embassy in Washington, which coordinated the consulates in an effort to discredit Salvemini. This attempt began early and proceeded at an intense pace. A telegram dated the 11th of August, 1926, for example, informed the Italian police that the ambassador had sent a representative to the International Institute of Education to protest Salvemini's visit, which the embassy believed would be financed by the IIE. According to the embassy, Salvemini's tour would be inopportune because, even if he would have abstained from attacking the Italian government at the Institute, nothing prevented him from doing so elsewhere. If this occurred, the embassy argued significantly, and here I quote, his activities would provoke disorders in the Italian-American communities, which would ill-bear attacks against the Italian government, unquote. The Institute's secretary responded that Salvemini's trip was uncertain, but at any rate, the Institute would insist upon the abstention from politics in any lectures. Salvemini did not come to the United States under the Institute's auspices, but through a manager, as noted by the New York Consul General on the 2nd of November, 1926, and as Salvemini himself stated in his memoirs. What is interesting, however, is that the Consul General had already contacted a certain Professor Bigongiati to show up at a Salvemini talk before the Foreign Policy Association to rebut him. Bigongiati refused because he had previously had a debate with Salvemini in Florence, but suggested Professor Bruno Rosselli, later identified as head of the Italian department at Vassar, as the ideal person to answer Salvemini's attacks on the fascist regime. If Rosselli refused, Bigongiati promised to recruit someone else. This proved unnecessary because Rosselli agreed, becoming the consul's advisor on this issue and Salvemini's chief gadfly during his lectures. During his time in the United States, the embassy organized a campaign against Salvemini, so there was someone to rebut him everywhere he spoke. At the same time, the Italian ambassador approached Secretary of State Kellogg and other high officials in the State Department to deny Salvemini a visa. They responded negatively. Since no legal reason existed, they argued, a scandal would result which would benefit Salvemini. In order to demonstrate the department's good faith, the officials informed the embassy that they had already conducted an investigation in Europe to see if Salvemini had any anarchist or communist antecedents, but were unable to find any. Admitting the department's valid position, the embassy nonetheless believed it important to call the department's attention to the incidents which Salvemini's presence would certainly provoke in the Italian-American community, which held the highest admiration for the Italian government. Consular and ambassadorial reports to the Interior Ministry during Salvemini's second tour of the United States make it clear that Salvemini stepped up his attacks on fascism during this time. A telegram dated the 6th of June, 1930, which reports on a talk given by Salvemini at the People's House in New York, explains why and how. Salvemini had earlier contended that the fascist regime would be a long time in falling. Now, he said, he had changed his mind because of the magnificent organization of the opposition and the open unrest which had broken out in parts of Italy. In truth, the Depression and its discontents had animated anti-fascists and fueled a burst of illusory optimism. What makes Salvemini's remark significant, however, is the role he assigned to Italian Americans in the future fall of fascism, that is, to finance the revolution. He held out the Irish example, stating that while the focus of the anti-English struggle was in Ireland and England, the funds were collected in America. Salvemini concluded, and here I quote, "Like the Irish, the Italians in America must be the financiers of the revolution in their homeland." Greater knowledge of the Italian-American community would soon disabuse Salvemini and his friends of the extent to which that community would sponsor the fight against fascism. In fact, most Italian-Americans were hard workers trying to succeed in a difficult situation, and they concentrated on economic activities. Furthermore, having been ill-treated and discriminated against in their adopted country, they appreciated the new prestige which the fascist regime had brought to their homeland in American eyes. During Salvemini's talks against fascism, bankers who had made loans to Mussolini's Italy were usually present to object that the Duce had transformed Italy, thus justifying increased American economic confidence. When Salvemini explained the corporate state to American labor union leaders, they cheered instead of being shocked. As Salvemini complained time after time, the myth was that everything was rotten in Italy until Mussolini had taken over, after which everything was beautiful. Salvemini was exasperated by the constant repetition that the trains ran on time and that the Italians now had bathrooms. The pro-fascist orientation of American society and American leaders has been excellently described in John Dickens' Mussolini and Fascism, The View from America, and we need not go beyond these few examples. Salvemini attempted to reverse the pro-fascist American attitude, but he failed. This failure should come as no surprise. The point is that most Italian Americans had emigrated from the old country for economic reasons. Many of those who wished to return, and there were substantial numbers, had already done so. In fact, in making his argument for giving the vote to illiterates at the beginning of the century, illiterates in Italy, Salvemini himself had highlighted the returning American immigrants, who, he argued, should vote because they had learned practical democracy in the United States. While attached to their homeland, Italian Americans had concerns and views which were American, not Italian, and the Americans were strongly pro-fascist. Salvemini had emigrated for political reasons, and his concerns were Italian, not American. He and other highly educated Italians wished to return to Italy once fascism ended, even if some of them wound up not doing so. In short, the Italian anti-fascist exiles formed a sort of club separated by class, education, and temperament from the bulk of Italian Americans. This went for Salvemini as well. Born a poor Southerner, but whose elegant education both speaks well for the Giolitian era he condemned and drove a wedge between him and his origins. In Italy, Salvemini attempted to maintain contact with those origins, but we must conclude that he did not really understand the Italian-American milieu. It's quite different from the Southern Italian one. And a bit separated the refined and sophisticated Italian intellectuals and the majority of Italian Americans. Salvemini and his fellow professors at the University of Chicago, at Smith, and other institutions were no match for the consulate and the church in bridging the gap. As might be expected, Salvemini got along much better with his colleagues at Harvard and other universities, and American liberals in general, than he did with Italian Americans. Salvemini's correspondence during his Harvard period testifies to the close contact which he had with American liberals. That correspondence also testifies to something else: a single-minded pursuit of persons he considered Italian-American fascists, and his possible misinterpretation of their aims. There's no doubt that a person of Salvemini's intelligence understood that only a small percentage of Italian-Americans were fascists, and he said so in writing. Salvemini, however, practically ran a harsh one-man investigating committee of people he suspected to be fascist. There's been a running dispute as to whether or not his activities constituted a violation of civil rights or might have falsely branded some people as being fascist. Without getting to that argument, and granting the meticulousness of his research, a dispassionate observer may recognize that there was something vengeful in his approach. He compiled the work on Italian fascist activities in the United States, posthumously published by Philip Cannistraro, designed to focus the attention of Congress on the activities of Italian fascists, which attendance at fascist-inspired rallies served as one proof of strong fascist sympathies. During World War II, he let the FBI have the manuscript. We might cite another example of his views in his letter to Hugh de Lacy, chairman of the American Committee for Protection of Foreign-Born. Salvemini refused to sign an open letter seeking to kill a provision of a bill allowing the denaturalization of citizens on the ground that a naturalized person's, quote, utterances, writings, actions, or course of conduct establishes that his political allegiance is to a foreign state or sovereignty, unquote. Salvemini objected that such a provision was not bad, although he suggested its enforcement be entrusted to the regular judiciary. Informed that this vague provision was unnecessary because the Justice Department was already empowered to proceed against nationalized citizens who were disloyal, and that the section undermined the status of naturalized citizens, Salvemini answered crustily on April 13, 1942, that while it was difficult to prove a person had taken the citizenship oath in bad faith, quote, vice versa, it is not difficult to prove that the writings, addresses, activities of a man are inconsistent with his oath of allegiance, whether they precede or follow such an oath. I know a great many Italian-born and naturalized would fall under such a law, and I think that they would deserve to be deprived of their citizenship, unquote. This is but one illustration of attitudes which indicate an emotional misunderstanding of the Italian-American experience, an insensitivity to civil rights, and a vengeful view. On the other hand, Salvemini's intransigence was not limited to this issue or to this time. He had a history of cantankerousness and always expressed himself strongly and frequently immoderately, not only in the United States but in Italy. It was the flip side of a character which made him such a strong anti-fascist, but it was not calculated to win him friends among an Italian-American community which, ironically, hailed primarily from his own beloved South. The Harvard connection and World War II. Besides assuring themselves the support of the Italian-American community, Italian diplomats in the United States attempted to deprive Salvemini of influence in the intellectual community. In April 1930, the Boston Consul General reported that he had objected to Harvard for hiring Salvemini as a visiting professor. He reported that strong opposition to the move existed among Harvard's administrators, and that, in part, ignorance of Salvemini's politics was responsible for the gaffe. According to the Consul General's Harvard informant, the administration, quote, read him, Salvemini, the Riot Act, unquote, telling him that he was absolutely not to make any reference to present-day Italy in his course. Other Italian documents make clear that the diplomats had strong contact with Harvard professors and that they believed that substantial opposition to an appointment for Salvemini existed. But on April 29, 1933, the Foreign Ministry requested information from the Interior Ministry on the circumstances of Salvemini's leaving Italy, whether he had really been a professor in Italy, and whether it was true that his mother had been a Yugoslav subject. The purpose, quote, to attempt to block, if we are still in time, Salvemini's appointment to Harvard University, unquote. Despite assurances to the contrary from their Harvard informant, the Foreign Ministry reported on May 8th that Salvemini had indeed been offered a chair. Italian officials attempted to sabotage the appointment by reporting that Salvemini had been implicated in a plot to kill the Duce by planting a bomb in St. Peter's Basilica. But Salvemini challenged Mussolini to extradite him by bringing evidence in an American court, and the government dropped the whole affair. Despite what appears to have been significant opposition to Salvemini, the appointment had gone through. It represented a significant defeat for the fascist authorities because from this base, Salvemini was able to organize his anti-fascist activities not among Italian-American community leaders, who, much to Salvemini's chagrin, smoothly made clear their loyalty to the United States once the war began, but among Italian intellectuals in American universities and American liberals. These colleagues included G.A. Borghese at the University of Chicago, Max Ascoli at the New School, Michele Cantarella at Smith, and Arturo Toscanini. Even after Italy's entrance into the war, the Italians followed Salvemini's activities very closely. The introduction of the racial laws into Italy stimulated the exodus of Italian Jews to the United States, adding to the anti-fascist ranks. The French defeat swelled the anti-fascist groups and added well-known personalities such as Carlo Sforza and Alberto Tacchiani. In order to influence future American policy towards Italy, to stimulate more opposition to the Italian regime, and to spur the birth of a republic, Salvemini inspired the foundation of a new organization in 1940. While Salvemini kept in the background in Boston, Ascoli became president of this new Mazzini Society, and Tacchiani became its secretary. Despite this hopeful beginning, the Mazzini Society soon split. As the war progressed, Salvemini became convinced that President Roosevelt had decided to leave determination of Italy's future configuration in the hands of Winston Churchill and the British, who favored a continuation of the Savoy monarchy. In addition, Salvemini had always been anti-clerical and had stepped up his attacks on the Vatican after the Lateran Accords of 1929, which created opposition to him among American Catholics. Furthermore, Salvemini divided the responsibility of the Italian people from Mussolini, who had stabilized his government by receiving crucial support from American and European conservatives. Such considerations led him to argue against any compromise with persons who had collaborated with fascism for a favorable peace treaty, maintenance of Italy's frontiers, and Italian self-determination in choosing the form of government. Mazzini Society officers, led primarily by Sforza and Ascoli, were reluctant to attack Roosevelt and Churchill frontally and advocated prudence. This is one quality which Salvemini decidedly lacked. The result was that the society split between the Salvemini group and the followers of Sforza, a dispute which also involved certain State Department offices. Salvemini's opposition to American policy toward Italy produced the threat of the Justice Department instituting denaturalization proceedings against him. According to Salvemini collaborator Enzo Tagliacozzo, Salvemini's fear that the Sforza group's attitude would compromise his campaign in favor of an Italian republic among Americans explains his adamant position on the issue. The debate over this question of Anglo-American policy toward Italy led to publication of a book, What to Do with Italy, co-authored with La Piana. Written in Salvemini's customarily clear and uncompromising style, this book synthesizes the Salvemini group's position at the end of the Second World War with regard to a republic, the Vatican, and Europe's future. Most of all, however, it is a scathing criticism of British policy, a position which echoes Salvemini's correspondence during this period. Summarizing Salvemini's position, by blaming Mussolini alone and not the entire fascist regime for the war, and by urging the Italians to get rid of one man and one man only, Churchill was telling the Italians, quote, that what they should do is merely to substitute fascism without Mussolini for fascism with Mussolini, and everything will be fine, end quote. This book and his support of the resistance represented Salvemini's last battles on American soil. He resumed teaching at the University of Florence in October 1949 and died at Capo di Sorrento on September 6, 1957, at age 84. How should we judge Salvemini's American experience? This is a very difficult question, for while it is clear that he influenced American students who still speak about their experiences with him, though he lives on in his numerous articles and books of the American period and a significant introductory essay to A. William Salamoni's Italian Democracy in the Making, his influence remains elusive. But this elusiveness is not restricted to the American period. Even in Italy, the same consideration would apply. In both countries, he was respected for his uprightness, his consistency, his logic, his analytical prowess, and his historical research. But Salvemini was not the kind of person who could leave a party or a school, which probably explains the lack of biographies about him in Italian as well as in English, and why a typical party view, such as Deccaro's, is so hostile to him. I know you're missing the last page. On the other hand, however, it might just be that Salvemini was actually the prototype of the sophisticated rebel of the late 20th century, described in a recent book by H. Stuart Hughes, an old Harvard colleague and friend, an intellectual unattached to parties, stubbornly resisting the will of powerful groups and governments, and somehow prevailing in the end. Thank you.
Our commentator for Professor Discala's paper is Philip V. Cannistraro, who is Professor of History at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Professor Cannistraro is an expert on Italian fascism. He has published widely in the field, including studies dealing with fascism and anti-fascism among Italian Americans. The work by Salvemini alluded to by Spencer was an unpublished manuscript that had to be reconstructed as well as published, and having accomplished that task, Professor Cannistraro published it as the title Italian Fascist Activities in the United States. His latest book, just released by Morrow, is a biography of Margherita Sarfatti entitled Il Duce's Other Woman. An Italian translation of this new and important work will be forthcoming in May. He is presently writing a biography of Generosa Pope, which will be published by Oxford University Press.
Thank you, Professor Pernicone. I want to apologize, first of all, for not having prepared my comments in advance, so you don't have a copy in your folder, but I was working on them until about 5 minutes ago, actually. Professor Discala has shown us that Salvemini was not only an important figure in Italian history, but that he was a man whose active career reached into this country as a political exile from Mussolini's dictatorship, especially between the years 1931 and 1943. And this is a phase which Salvemini, a phase of Salvemini's life that deserved to be better known. It was and remains a controversial period that continues to elicit conflicting interpretations. As Professor Discala revealed, it is clear that the thesis presented by Deccaro many years ago, namely that Salvemini isolated himself in the enchanted island of Harvard University and withdrew from active participation in political struggles, is untenable. It's a tremendously rich subject, and what I would like to do in my comments is just take one specific aspect of the broad range of experience that Professor Discala has described for us, and especially to note that Professor Discala's paper raises a really important question, the question of really whether the origins of the post-war Italian Republic may, at least in part, be found in the experience of Salvemini and his anti-fascist colleague during the 1940s, during the war. Professor Discala's thesis is that Salvemini's efforts in the United States must be judged a failure. If by that we mean that his efforts to, quote, reverse the pro-fascist American attitude failed. And Discala maintains that this failure was due to the inherent weakness of the Fortitudo. and this is a quote, "The Italian anti-fascist exiles formed a sort of club separated by class, education, and temperament from the bulk of Italian Americans." This one for Salvemini as well. We must conclude, says Discala, that he did not really understand the Italian-American milieu. In Salvemini's case, this failure was compounded, argues Discala, by Salvemini's political rigidity, his inability to cooperate with his own fellow anti-fascists, and his moral intransigence. While I agree with Professor Discala's general argument concerning the fuoriusciti, I would argue that Salvemini's American experience, and especially his understanding of and his reaction to the Italian-American community, should be seen in a different light. Salvemini was perhaps, I think, the exception to the rule of his fellow fuoriusciti. A closer examination of his role in the struggle to combat the influence of Italian-American prominenti between 1940 and 1943 reveals, I think, that no Italian exile better understood the nature of the power struggle of the Italian-American community. When Salvemini joined others in founding the Mazzini Society in late 1939, he did so because he believed that by countering fascist sympathies in the Italian-American community and in American society at large, the fuoriusciti would be able to influence post-war U.S. policy toward Italy. This was, first and foremost, their goal. Salvemini's understanding of the importance of reaching the Italian-Americans derived not from any nostalgic solidarity with people of his own national background, but from an analysis of the American political system as it functioned in the 1930s, namely the importance of the ethnic vote in the political struggle of FDR's electoral successes. The fuoriusciti concluded that those who influenced Italian-American opinion and voting behavior, namely the prominenti, were the real enemy in the anti-fascist struggle in the United States, especially after December 1941. In this context, the principal target of the Mazzini Society and of Salvemini's efforts for some time was my friend Generoso Pope, the most influential Italian-American supporter of Mussolini in America. Pope was a millionaire owner of a construction company, published Il Progresso Americano and other Italian-language papers, and most important, was a powerfully connected figure in Tammany Hall. Salvemini expected that in the struggle against the prominenti, the exiles of the Mazzini Society would join forces with the older generation of Italian immigrant activists that included socialists, anarchists, and syndicalists, many of whom had been here for many, many years before the fuoriusciti arrived. In Salvemini's mind, one principal figure stood out among these leaders as having the greatest potential to assist in the cause, and that was Luigi Antonini, the Social Democratic head of the ILGWU's Local 89. Elsewhere, I've argued that Antonini was, in his own way, as much of a prominente as Pope. Both of them were naturalized U.S. citizens whose lives, careers, and futures were tied permanently to the United States. For them, Italy was a personal point of reference, but it was not the source of their power. Their power they derived only from the ethnic factor, from the existence of a compact mass of Italian-American immigrants who voted, or possibly could vote, as a bloc. In terms of this ethnic factor, Pope and Antonini held very similar positions. Personally, both were ambitious, shrewd, egotistical. Both controlled access to hundreds of thousands of Italian Americans through newspapers, radio stations, employment opportunities. Both wielded considerable financial resources. Both were well connected politically, judges, public officials. And both were able and did bring out the vote among their constituencies for Roosevelt. The Democratic National Committee considered Antonini and Pope the linchpins of Roosevelt's election victories in New York. And as a result, they were visitors to the White House, and they exercised considerable influence on U.S. policy toward Italy. The only factor separating Pope and Antonini was that one was a fascist sympathizer and the other an anti-fascist. The weak link between Antonini and Salvemini's friends in the Mazzini Society was the fact that Antonini found it difficult to balance his role as an Italian-American leader with his position as an anti-fascist. No one knew that better than Salvemini did. Political opportunity had led Antonini to collaborate with other leaders of the Italian-American community, regardless of what their position was on the question of fascism. In 1934, Antonini got the ILGWU to adopt an anti-fascist platform. And that year, he and Pope went to war against each other for about 6 months. Then, the next year, both men decided that it was in their interest to arrange a truce, and each agreed to stop all personal attacks. Thereafter, they collaborated with each other when necessary, and they appeared on the same platforms. Salvemini and his comrades soon discovered that despite a relentless and a bitter campaign to expose and discredit Pope, he would not be easily brought down. When Pope's back was to the wall in the summer of 1941, and the Mazzini Society was on the verge of seizing editorial control of his newspaper, Pope went to Washington, and Roosevelt came to his rescue. When Pope and the other Prominenti reacted to Pearl Harbor by breaking with Mussolini and declaring their loyalty to the United States, Antonini welcomed these men whom Salvemini called pre-Pearl Harbor fascists and tried to bring them into the war effort. Salvemini, at that point, knew the game was up. Salvemini judged Antonini harshly, but not merely out of a moral outrage over his refusal to join in the fight against Pope and the Prominenti. He began to see that in the Antonini-Pope alliance were the roots of what became a broad and subtle struggle for control of U.S. policy toward Italy, a struggle between the Mazzini Society and the Prominenti. This realization on Salvemini's part, I would argue, was the first step in Salvemini's separation from his colleagues in the Mazzini Society. Professor Discala explains that Salvemini became convinced that Roosevelt was prepared to allow the British to determine Italy's future, and that Count Sforza was ready to accept such an arrangement. The result would be, in Salvemini's mind, that Italy would have a post-war government run by former fascist Catholics in the House of Savoy. My point is that even before Salvemini came to this conclusion, he had understood that Roosevelt might possibly allow the conservative Prominenti to influence Italian policy in exactly the same direction. In December of 1941, Antonini moved to take control of Italian policy in the United States through the formation of the Italian-American Labor Council, and he invited a wide spectrum of Italian leaders, including those whom Salvemini attacked as pre-Pearl Harbor fascists, to participate in that effort. Salvemini now began to demand that the Mazzini Society keep its distance from Antonini, and Alberto Tarchiani, the Society's president, scolded him, and this is a quote from a letter, "I beg you, Salvemini, not to fantasize too much. We must not forget that the only organization that's been capable of a practical anti-fascism has been precisely Antonini." Salvemini saw Tarchiani's point only too well, I would argue. When some Fuoriusciti suggested splitting the Mazzini Society into two groups, one Italian and one American group, Salvemini supported the idea because he saw the Antonini-Pope relationship as symptomatic of the political ties between FDR and the Prominenti. And he became convinced that anti-fascism had to be free from the constraints of American domestic politics. It is evident, he told Ascoli, this is a quote from a letter, that between the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Ed Flynn, Ed Corsi, Antonini, Pope and company, there is an agreement to the effect that they have to control Italian affairs in this country. And when Sforza agreed to speak at a huge meeting of Antonini's organization, the IALC, an enraged Salvemini wrote the following letter to him. Quote, "I am deeply disturbed by your attitude toward such Italo-Americans as Pope and Corsi, who have contributed to poisoning the Italo-Americans with fascist misinformation. I do not think we have to fight them now that they have changed with the wind. But we have to maintain that people who have been helping Mussolini for the last 20 years should not claim leading positions in the present political setup. I know that the administration wants us to put ourselves at the service of Pope and Corsi, but I am not an agent of the administration, and neither should," he said, "the Mazzini Society." After America's entry in the war, Pope's rehabilitation in the government's eyes proceeded rapidly, especially as Pope began to raise millions in war bonds. When the government sponsored a series of Italian-American Victory Councils in 1942, Antonini agreed to participate with Pope and other pre-Pearl Harbor fascists. The next year, Antonini and Pope joined forces again in creating ACID, the American Committee for Italian Democracy, whose platform, I would stress, effectively expropriated the Mazzini Society's position on post-war Italian reconstruction. By the end of 1943, Salvemini and his friends had left the Mazzini society and aptly had resigned as its president. Antonini then seized control of the Mazzini Society and put his own men in charge. And the new leaders of the group endorsed a resolution supporting the Roosevelt-Churchill policy of collaboration with Badoglio and the monarchy. Did Salvemini, as Tatiani suggested, fantasize too much? Perhaps. But Salvemini's fulminations against Antonini and his own colleagues were not the rantings of an isolated intellectual removed from the real world. If anything, we may find fault with him for perhaps overestimating the degree to which the Prominenti would be able to influence the State Department in a post-war world in which the ethnic factor would be less important than it once had been. And perhaps also in having underestimated the strength of the resistance movement at home in Italy in shaping the new republic that was to come. But I believe that we cannot accuse Salvemini of having been an ivory tower intellectual and not understanding the nature of the Italian-American community. I think he understood it too well.